Hello, welcome to HBM's Crypto-Corner for Wednesday, February 22nd, 2023. We have a few things to talk about, so let's get started. To start it off, we have an interesting article. More Victoria residents believe in Bigfoot than you might think. Professor talks about people's fascination with the fabled creature. The West Coast has long been known and mocked for its Bigfoot and Sasquatch sightings, including on Vancouver Island. But do people actually believe the creature exists? Dr. Jeff Melner was professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. He also researches Bigfoot heavily and centers his work on the evolution of hominin bipedalism. Speaking on the landscapes of BC, he says, there's a lot of interest and attention to the temperate rainforests of the coastal Pacific Northwest. It's an amazing habitat and extremely rich. I think, and others like myself, held the notion that these temperate rainforests were probably the pure habitat of this large primate. It may have been the habitat that allowed the expansion into North America from Asia, where they almost certainly originated. As evidenced by the fossil record of large apes in Asia, as well as the contemporary reports of something that on the surface appears remarkably consistent with Bigfoot or Sasquatch. Since they inhabit the land so heavily compared to other parts of the world, according to Melder, it raises the question, do citizens of BC believe Bigfoot is real? Here's a video which kind of takes a formal, or I guess informal survey of residents.
Hey there, I'm Ella Matt with Victoria News, and I'm here asking people in Victoria and Greater Victoria if they think Bigfoot is real or not, and why.
No, I don't believe Bigfoot is real.
Until Bigfoot is proven not to be real, maybe he was like a prehistoric creature of some kind. Was this got like uniced, like an ice age or something? I don't know.
I have never thought about it deeply, and I guess I feel like maybe I do.
There's no facts about it, no real evidence.
I'm a person who doesn't disbelieve a lot of things because I have no proof.
He's very real to many people.
I feel like it's just created like a lot of like theories and like a lot of like, I think people just assume what they want to assume type of thing.
It's funny, I just read an article yesterday about them thinking that Bigfoot sightings are probably bears standing on their hind legs. So I'd like to believe they're real, but I don't.
Is mystery real, or if in the imagination he might be real? But there are some people who've seen him, so maybe he is.
I'm not entirely sure. Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot of evidence to prove that maybe he's not real, but you don't know.
I do. Like, why not? If you look at the stuff that surrounds us, like all the deep woods and everything, he could be living like right beside us and we wouldn't even know. Why not? Crazier things have happened, I think.
I mean, I know a lot of people think he's real, but I personally don't believe in that kind of stuff. If people believe he's real, great, go for it, but I just don't think he is.
I think most likely not, but being from Washington, it's kind of the fun part of the lore, and I think without Bigfoot gives us a little less hope, I think it's just something that we all kind of need sometimes to just keep the fantasy alive.
Over half of the unnamed people that were interviewed for this story on Government Street and at the University of Victoria said they do not believe in Bigfoot, while 36% said they do, and another 36% said they don't. A common theme among people was that even if they didn't believe in Bigfoot, they still seemed to like that the creature is an interesting thing rooted in BC culture. Meldrum gives some tips on where to look for Bigfoot. When you're off-road or off-trail, very little of the terrain takes a track. So if you wanted to go up your chances, if you want to buy extra lottery tickets, then look for areas where there might be a trace found. Unimproved dirt roads, trails that have moist areas, and that's not hard to find on Vancouver Island. Creek banks, lake margins, those types of things increase your odds of finding footprints. He also suggests that folks better train themselves to keep their eyes peeled for wildlife in general. If you go out hoping to find a Bigfoot, but you've never seen a bear, a deer, or fox, those animals are much more common, he adds. If you develop your skills of wildlife observation so that you do see the signs, if not the animals themselves, their footprints, their burrows, their hair, then you'll up your odds of noting this much sign of this much rare animal. Be prepared and have your little kit. In your day pack, make sure you do have a camera. So those are just some tips from Dr. Meldrum on how to perhaps have a Sasquatch sighting. And some interesting men on the street interviews as well. So interesting stuff, I have to say. Now here's something interesting. Watch. Bigfoot film traversing mountain in Utah. And here's the footage, but apparently it's only footprints. And I'll explain in a second after we watch this video how this could possibly not be Sasquatch.
Rocky Mountain Sasquatch. Several folks asked if anyone had searched for tracks, and others stated we should send a drone up to where a suspect Bigfoot was filmed running up a steep mountainside near one of the high elevation Wasatch Front mountain peaks. A helicopter pilot flew over the Wasatch Front mountain range looking for evidence right after watching the video, not saying that was a Bigfoot running in an uphill direction on a very steep mountainside in deep snowpack that is windswept and iced over most of the day, nor am I saying that these giant footprints in this large trackway is Bigfoot. However, this trackway is consistent with most credible Bigfoot trackways when the creature is running or moving at a brisk pace.
So you're not saying it's Bigfoot, but it's Bigfoot, right? Is that what you're saying, Kelly Shaw from the Rocky Mountain Sasquatch Organization? I don't like these guys. They promote hoaxes. I don't like them. I'm sorry, I just don't like them. And they can dislike me all they want, but I'm going to be honest. These guys promote hoaxes. Period. End of discussion. They promote misidentifications as well. So really, they really have no credibility as far as I'm concerned.
These brisk-paced trackways usually have long strides and the footprints are directly in front of each other as if the creature is walking a tightrope. Perhaps one or both of these pieces of video evidence is just a coincidence, or one or both is actual evidence of this rare, elusive giant. Keep on watching. We're going to keep on squatching.
Now that previous footage, was that supposed to be a Sasquatch walking up a hill? What, humans can't walk up hills? Gosh, I didn't realize humans couldn't walk up hills. A remarkable video out of Utah shows what appears to be a sizable creature crossing the peak of a snow-covered mountain with ease, and some suspect the peculiar traveler could be Bigfoot. The wild footage was reportedly captured last Wednesday by a witness who was observing the Wasatch Mountain range from the nearby community of Farmington. To his surprise, he noticed something moving across the mountain's Francis Peak at an elevation of around 9,500 feet, where the terrain was covered with a thick layer of snow, and proceeded to film the strange scene with his cell phone. While the distance from which witness captured the footage makes it difficult to discern what the anomaly could be, the manner in which it moves suggests that it is particularly adept at maneuvering through the treacherous terrain. In the video showcased above, the dark object can be seen at the bottom of the screen as it swiftly travels up the side of the mountain. Adding another layer of intrigue to the sighting is that shortly after it was posted online by the Rocky Mountain Sasquatch Organization, a curious helicopter pilot actually flew over the area where the suspected Sasquatch was filmed. Amazingly, their footage shows a series of sizable single-file tracks that looked like they were left behind by a large creature as it was walking or running in the snow. Given the isolated area where the anomalous creature was filmed and the speed with which it moved, this would seem to preclude the possibility that there was a person hiking on the side of the mountain. That said, skeptical observers will no doubt suggest that the Sasquatch seen in the video is probably native wildlife, such as a moose, a deer, or a mountain goat. Which, the thing is, okay, there was video taken of this supposed creature, a supposed Sasquatch, but we don't know for sure. To be quite honest, it's not clear enough to make that determination. And what I hate is when the Rocky Mountain Sasquatch organization says, well, we're not saying it's Bigfoot, but it's Bigfoot. I mean, yeah, real good way to be objective. They're not objective. They promote hoaxes. You know, I'm sick of holding my tongue about these people. They're not objective, and they promote hoaxes. Period. End of discussion. That should lessen their credibility in anybody's eyes, if you ask me. On a happier note, here is a very interesting article about Dr. Gregory Forth and his research into a tiny ape-like humanoid may still be living in plain sight, scientist says. Don't be shy, little guy. Flores, Indonesia is the home of the scientific study of small humans. Theories of retired Professor Gregory Forth continue to proliferate the hope of finding a living Homo floresiensis. Forth's 2022 book spells out his multi-decade search for evidence of a continually living human-like species. The scientific community believe a small species of human known as Homo floresiensis once lived on the island of Flores, Indonesia, around 50,000 years ago. But one professor thinks the ape-like humanoids could still live there. Evolution be damned. Think of this as the hunt for Bigfoot, only with a much smaller target. Forth has studied the Homo floresiensis for roughly 4 decades, first when at the University of Oxford and then at the University of Alberta. He wrote a book in 2022, Between Ape and Human, an anthropologist on the trail of a hidden hominoid, and the Debrief recently ran an interview with Forth on the quest. Forth still believes in the modern interpretation of what the locals call the lei hoa. What really interested me in the lei hoa is that it was small, like the figures in Nage country, Forth tells the Debrief, but it was reckoned still to be alive. And indeed, there were a few people around, it seemed, who claimed to have seen one or more. These creatures have a human-like upright gait, come hairier than humans but not as hairy as an ape, and have a distinct ape-like face, according to the Leo people's accounts to Forth. The professor's hopes of a living Homo floresiensis were emboldened at the finding of fossils roughly 20 years ago. When the reports started coming out, I was quite amazed, he tells the Debrief, because what people were describing, what paleoanthropologists were describing, and indeed reconstructing, sounded very much like what the Leo people had been describing to me the previous summer. Forth's book purports that these ape-man creatures lived at least into modern times, and he believes credible sightings mean that there is a chance of a small population still exists. The search for a modern-day lei hoa presses on. And I read that book, and it's quite fascinating. His book, it really lays out the case for the possibility. Now, Forth doesn't necessarily say, yes, I believe in it, in the book, but he's fascinated by it. And as long as there is a fascination, there's always the chance that some scientist is going to pick up on it. As Dr. Forth has, and perhaps find interest in it, and maybe see about studying it, and perhaps bringing it to light, if indeed there are actual modern living ancestors of the Homo floresiensis, which would be interesting, would it not? Finally, we have an article by Nick Redfern about the mysterious apes in the United Kingdom, a cryptozoological mystery. Yes, I really did say there are apes in the UK. Escaped animals from zoos? Probably not. Something paranormal? Almost certainly. Yes. Let's have a look at some of these very strange animals in no specific order. Here they are. Certainly one of the most bizarre of all the cases that falls into the domain of this particular category dates from 1789 and is referenced in an old document that comes from the private collection of a noted family of landowners in Cornwall. The details are unfortunately very scant indeed, but nevertheless of a deep significance, given what we have read thus far and what is still yet to come. It concerned an immense monkey-like creature seen on several occasions at Crowless near Penzance. The creature was seen by local folk late at night on at least 3 occasions and was described as being around 8 feet in height and made a strange whistling noise that was interpreted as a call. To who or what mercifully remains unknown. Most notable of all, when the creature was last seen at the height of a violent thunderstorm, it literally disappeared in an almighty flash of light. And here's our next case. Several years ago, I received an email from a man who had an intriguing but unfortunately very brief story to relate. The details, from Keith Fletcher of Derby, concerned a story told to him back in the mid-1980s by a work colleague who hailed from Cornwall of a huge ape seen roaming Bodmin Moor, England. More 6 or 7 years prior to when Keith heard the story, which would have placed the event somewhere in the latter part of the 1970s. In this case, said Keith, the animal vanished into what was described as a small black cloud and just sort of disintegrated like a ghost. Moving on, but still very much on definitive Bodmin Moor turf, and very possibly even directly linked to the words and memories of Keith Fletcher, Big Cat researcher Marcus Matthews has gone on record with a story that is well worth citing right here. In Marcus's very own words, I have learned from a relation that in the 1970s and 1980s there were always rumors of an escaped orangutan ape in the area. Farmers coming home from the public houses were used to seeing a strange pair of eyes looking at them, and the hairy human-like creature disappearing quickly. Now, to the green-faced monkey. The location cryptozoologist John Downes reveals was Churston Woods, which is situated close to the English holiday resort of Torbay. John says over a 6-week period in the summer of 1996, 15 separate witnesses reported seeing what they can only describe as a green-faced monkey running through the woods. Granted, some of the descriptions were quite vague, but most of the witnesses told of seeing a tailless animal around 4 to 5 feet tall with a flat olive green face that would run through the woods and occasionally would be seen swinging through the trees. Now, to me at least, this sounds like some form of primitive human, but again, of course, such things simply cannot exist in this country, and yet they seem to. And this area, Devon, Somerset, and Cornwall, is rich with such tales, you know. We'll take a trip now to the north of England and a monster lurking near Bottom Lake. Beyond any shadow of a doubt, one of the most sensational of all the many and varied British Bigfoot controversies of recent years is that which concerns a hairy man-like thing that has become known as the Beast of Balaam. In the latter part of 2002 and early 2003, John Downes recalls that, with respect to both him and his staff of the Center for Fortean Zoology, there occurred a huge flap of big hairy men, HBM, sightings throughout the British Isles that we could not afford to ignore and that required our immediate attention. Indeed, such was the scale of this extraordinary wave of encounters that, even as we made firm plans for an expedition in March, a handful of new sightings of large man beasts from the Bottom Lake area of Northumberland, England, arrived in our email inbox in January that prompted us to undertake an immediate study of the evidence. On a cold, wintry morning shortly afterwards, John and his team from the CFZ hit the road, headed north, and the adventure duly and truly began, when the creature craze was at its absolute height. And while he was personally on site, John Downs prepared careful and copious reports, written in an in-depth style that expertly detailed the significant role played by the Center for Fortean Zoology in the bizarre affair of the beast of Balaam. Those invaluable reports, made available for inclusion in this book, begin as follows in John's very own words. We liaised very closely with Jeff Lincoln, an absolutely invaluable researcher based in the area. We gave him our planned arrival time and asked if any of the eyewitnesses would be prepared to speak to us. Much to our everlasting delight, 5 out of the 6 were. We think it should be noted here that the 6th is a soldier. And with the burgeoning situation in the Middle East spiraling rapidly out of control, it would be completely unreasonable to expect a serving military man to be at the beck and call of the CFZ. Serendipitously, we were able to stay in a house owned by our County Durham representative, David Curtis. He and his wife, Joanne, were absolutely fantastic all the way through our sojourn in the north. The only sad thing about our stay with them was that Davy had to work most of the time, and so, therefore, was not able to join us during most of our activities. After what he described as a series of fairly dull misadventures best left unmentioned, John and the CFZ team then met up with Jeff Lincoln and Dr. Gail Nina Anderson, the latter a member of the CFZ's Board of Consultants, and made their way in convoy style to Bottom Lake itself. It would be nice to be able to say that we were overwhelmed with a spooky feeling, or that the genus loci of the location were in some way redolent of Freudian freakiness. But it wasn't at all. It was just what one would expect from a heavily wooded country park in the north of England in the middle of January, cold, wet, and gray. Jeff proceeded to show John no less than 3 locations where sightings of the Beast Man had occurred. We carried out a thorough series of photographic mapping exercises and did our best to fend off the incessant inquiries from the press. Just after lunchtime, a TV crew from a local television company arrived and filmed interviews with our investigation team. It was only after they had gone that we realized something very strange was happening. Now, this is John Downs, right here, the director of the Center for Fortean Zoology. After arriving on site, a veritable rave of Fortean chaos erupted in the direct vicinity of Balaam Lake, as John recalls graphically. Although we had tested all of our electronic equipment the night before, had charged up batteries where necessary, and even put new batteries in all our equipment that needed them, practically without exception, all of our new equipment failed. The laptop, for example, has a battery which usually lasts between 20 and 35 minutes. It lasted just 3 minutes before failing. Admittedly, we received an enormous number of telephone calls during our stay at the lake, but not anywhere near enough to justify the fact that we had to change handsets 4 times as many hours. The batteries in both Jeff's and our tape recorders also failed. It seems certain that there was some strange electromagnetic phenomenon at work here. We drove to a local pub where we met our first witnesses. Like all of the other people we were to meet over the next few days, they requested anonymity, and therefore, in accordance with our strict confidentiality policy, we have expected this. Naomi and her son had been visiting Balaam Lake only a few days before. Not believing any of the reports that had appeared in the local media, they were both appalled and frightened when, while walking across the car park itself, they had seen a huge creature sitting motionless in the woods. They described an intense feeling of fear and trepidation and rapidly left the area. They were incredibly cooperative and agreed to come back to the lake with us the next day to stage a reconstruction. It was on that next day That undeniable high strangeness affected the CFZ crew yet again, as John's notes clearly and carefully served to demonstrate. We had a wake-up call at 5:30 a.m. the next morning, followed by a taxi ride to a rest area over 500 yards along the road from the Bottom Lake car park, where we did a 2.5-minute interview for the BBC Radio 4 Today program. One thing of great importance happened during the half hour or so spent shivering by the side of the road waiting to speak to the BBC. Just before dawn, the crows, which live in a huge colony in the woods, started an appalling noise. Suddenly the noise stopped, but was then followed by a brief succession of booming noises, like a heavily amplified heartbeat from a Pink Floyd record, before the crows started up again. It is unclear whether these noises came from the vicinity of the lake itself or were made by the setup of satellite dishes and recording equipment that was loaded in the back of and on top of the BBC man's car. During the taxi journey back to see him, the driver remarked on the peculiar behavior of the crows and said that although he was a countryman himself and had spent his whole life living in this area, he had never heard anything quite like it. Arriving back at base, it was time for the entire CFZ expeditionary force to drive to the outskirts of the city of Newcastle, where we met with Jeff and a second witness in a cafe attached to a garden center. The witness, Neil, had been fishing at Bottom Lake one night 4 or 5 years previously. Together with two companions, he had been making his way back to the car park when he encountered a huge, dark, man-shaped object about 7 to 8 feet in height with what he described as sparkling eyes. The three fishermen did not stop to investigate but ran back to the car. No doubt, over the next few days, more and more sightings of Bigfoot-type creatures in the area were made. Now, to one of the most legendary cases in the UK, within the packed pages of Charlotte Sophia Burns' book of 1883, Shropshire Folklore, that the unholy antics of what some have since perceived to be the closest thing that Britain may have to North American Bigfoot and the Yeti of the Himalayas were first unleashed upon the unsuspecting general public. According to Byrne, a very weird story of an encounter with an animal ghost arose of late years within my knowledge. On the 21st of January 1879, a laboring man was employed to take a cart of luggage from Ranton in Staffordshire to Woodcock, beyond Newport in Shropshire, for the ease of a party of visitors who were going from one house to another. He was late in coming back. His horse was tired and he could only crawl along at a foot's pace, so that it was 10 o'clock at night when he arrived at the place where the high road crosses the Birmingham and Liverpool Canal. It was then, Byrne faithfully recorded, that the man received what was undoubtedly the most terrifying shock of his entire life. Before or since, it seems pretty safe to assume, just before he reached the canal bridge, a strange black creature with great white eyes sprang out of the plantation by the roadside and alighted on his horse's back. He tried to push it off with his whip, but to his horror the whip went right through the thing, and he dropped on the ground in fright. Needless to say, Byrne added, the poor, tired horse broke into a canter and rushed onwards at full speed with the ghost still clinging to its back. How the creature at length vanished, the man hardly knew. But the story was far from over, Byrne learned. He told his tale in the village of Woods Eaves, a mile further on, and so effectively frightened the hearers that one man actually stayed with friends there all night, rather than cross the terrible bridge which lay between him and his home. Byrne's wild story continued that by the time he reached the village of Woods Eaves, the unnamed man was in a state of excessive terror and promptly retired to his bed for several days, so much was he prostrated by his fright. Byrne also recorded that on the following day another individual traveled past the sinister bridge, and sure enough there was the man's whip, still lying in the very place where it had fallen to the ground after the nightmarish and bizarre encounter. Almost inevitably, dark tales of the crazed beast and its infernal nighttime activities began to spread like absolute wildfire throughout the little villages and hamlets of the area, as Byrne quickly learned and recorded thus in her book. The adventure, as was natural, was much talked of in the neighborhood, and of course with all sorts of variations. Most regrettably, Byrne failed to elaborate on the particular nature of these variations and gossip, but it seems that the local constabulary had heard all about the nature and exploits of the hairy demon and knew exactly what was afoot, or as Byrne carefully chronicled. Some days after the man's master was surprised by a visit from a policeman who came to request him to give information of his having been stopped and robbed on the big bridge on the night of the 21st of January. The master, who apparently was very much amused by this development in the escalating and seemingly mutating story, carefully explained to the visiting policeman that this was completely untrue and that, in reality, it was his employee who had reported a strange encounter at the big bridge, but that there was most definitely no robbery involved at all. Interestingly, when the real details of what had occurred were related to the policeman, he was seemingly completely nonplussed, came to the realization that no actual crime had been committed at all, and merely replied in a distinctly matter-of-fact fashion, "Oh, was that all, sir? Oh, I know what that was. That was the man-monkey, sir, as does come again at that bridge ever since the man was drowned in the cut. Notably, the creature is still seen, albeit in a spectral fashion, and usually late at night. So what does all this mean? Well, the idea that there could be huge apes roaming around the UK is ridiculous, yet people see them, and often, too. I can therefore only state that the creatures are paranormal entities. Perhaps that makes them even more intriguing. So, what do you think, folks? Could there be paranormal entities running around England which look a lot like Sasquatch? Are they ghosts? I mean, what are they? Could they possibly be spirits of creatures that lived there long ago? I think that's something we have to consider and think about. Or are they indeed paranormal entities? Well, I suppose you could say ghosts are paranormal entities. But it's interesting. It's very interesting. And I've talked about this before with Nick Redfern writing about paranormal Sasquatch or supposed paranormal Sasquatch. Refer back to some of my earlier episodes. Still quite fascinating. And that's going to do it for this week. I want to thank you very much for tuning in. You guys are the heart of the show. I always say that, but I always mean it. I'll continue to do this as long as you guys want me to. And hey, until next week, y'all be good or be good at. This is HBM's Crypto Corner.